So there's been a tectonic shift in two exciting areas over the past year. JavaScript tooling for the front end, where we've seen some pretty huge strides made, and web components. Now, at the start of the web, we had tags. We had form, we had select. You'd build your pages out of these tags, and they had meaning. They had encapsulation, they had default UI, they'd inform the page if an interesting event happened through rich DOM interfaces. Now, the way that we build apps on the front end these days is a little bit strange. We either copy large chunks of HTML from boilerplates like Bootstrap, or we sprinkle our pages with plugins and widgets that need to be configured with JavaScript. We end up in this situation of having to choose between bloated HTML, bloated JavaScript, or both. Here's an example of that. Let's talk about tabs for a moment. So tabs are a pretty common component on the web. But building a tab on the web today has gone from sort of doing a little bit in your JavaScript and most of it in your markup to increasingly doing more and more and more of your logic just in script. Now this feels a little bit weird to me because ideally I'd much prefer for HTML to be expressive enough to allow me to build my own tags that let me fill in the gaps between sort of what the platform doesn't give me with my own tags that are nice and declarative, that are easy to read and easy to use. So today we're going to talk about web components and how you can start off building apps using them and get a kickstart using some modern tooling. So over the weekend I was taking a look at this app built using Angular called JukeTube. And the idea behind JukeTube is that I can go and I can type in the name of any artist or song. So what does the fox say? And it'll go and it'll query YouTube for some search results and it'll return them back. I can then go and select and click on any item inside my results list and it'll add it to the end of this playlist to the very right. Now the cool thing about this playlist is that I can go and start playing videos, and as soon as a video has actually completed, it'll remove itself from the list and add itself to the history over here. It'll then keep on playing every other item on that list until you have no other videos left to play. And it gives you this really nice, rich sort of playlist that's collaborative. Other people at your party can go and add things to it. And it'll keep on going until the end of your party or the end of the videos have finished. So here's my version of the same application built using Polymer. So we can do the same thing. Let's look for something else this time. Maybe Britney Spears. So it's going and it's querying YouTube for the results. I can go and I can click on an item. It'll get added to the end of my playlist, and it works pretty much the exact same way that the Angular one does. The difference between these apps is that this application is built using elements. So we have an element representing my custom input at the very top. We have an element representing the different items in our results. We have an element representing our video. And we have an element representing the tabs at the very bottom. So we have an application built out of lots of different reusable components that we can go and drop into other applications. Even the search in this application has been abstracted away into its own element that I can drop into other apps and start, sort of creating. So it's really, really powerful. So today we're going to take a look at how to build this application. I'm not going to walk you through absolutely everything, but I'm going to give you enough that you can go and build this app off yourself. And I'm going to show you how to use tools like Yeoman to kickstart off your own Polymer applications. So hopefully this will be fun and a little bit useful. So before we jump into the Jukebox app I've been building, let's take a look at Polymer. Now, quick spoiler alert, standards are at the bottom of all of this stuff. And everything that I'm going to talk about is all based on sort of 4 W3C specifications. So templates, being able to define a section of the DOM to be inert, and being able to stamp it out for later use. We then have HTML imports, so bundling up CSS and JavaScript into a single unit and delivering it to another application. Now this is really great if we want to have a set of components and deliver it to an end user. We then have custom elements, so being able to define a new tag and teach the browser new tricks. So things like having our custom tab element, for example. And then we have Shadow DOM, which is sort of at the back of all of this. You don't have to use Shadow DOM, but if you do, you get things like encapsulation for free. So the first time you ever have sort of the ability to encapsulate styles, DOM, all of that stuff directly in the browser, and it's really, really nice. So Polymer has got some nice declarative element registration. It's very easy to go and create your own custom elements. It's got declarative inheritance, so if you want to go and extend existing elements inside the platform or extend elements that other people have created, it's really easy. You can go and get some nice declarative two-way data binding directly inside the platform. So as you can see, us using sort of the handlebars style tags, easily binding data from our JavaScript straight back to our UI, and it all just constantly staying in sync. We've got declarative event handlers, so being able to say, okay, well, on click I want something to happen, bind that back to my JavaScript very easily. You've got access to published properties. You've got property watchers, so what I showed you earlier with attributes changing. Automatic node finding, so that nice sort of jQuery style. It's not the jQuery API, but it's a jQuery style of accessing nodes inside your element. And then things like pointer events and pointer gestures by default. Lots and lots of things that are in the future web platform available at your fingertips right away. So let's say that I'd like to use Bower to start a new project. I can actually just go to the command line, and this is a blank directory. Let's say that I started off a new Bower project just by running Bower init. This will just ask me a few questions about my app, and I'm just going to use the default answers for all of these. But what this will basically do is it will write me a bower.json file where I can store some information about my different dependencies, and it looks good to me, so I'm just going to say yes. So I now want to install Polymer, and there's some interesting notes here. So if I install Polymer/platform, and we're just going to pass save, so it actually saves the dependency to our bower.json file, this will install just the polyfills layer of Polymer. So that gives you sort of access to the template tag, HTML imports, custom elements, shadow DOM, and if you want to use Polymer itself, so the sugaring layer, you can allow any element that you install after that to go and pull in the Polymer sort of sugaring layer as a dependency on its own. Or you can just go and install platform Polymer. But in this case, we're just going to install sort of platform. So let's do that. So this is going to go, it's going to check on the latest version of Polymer, and now it's installed. Let's say that the next thing I'd like to do is actually start installing some elements. Now, I can actually install, let's say, an Ajax element. So let's clear the screen just so it's a little bit easier to read. So I can say Bower install Polymer, and Polymer Ajax is the name of the element that we want to try out. So it's going to go and it's going to fetch the latest version of Polymer Ajax, and I'm just going to say I'd like to use the version in master. Now, what's really cool here is let's just fire up a new server so we can actually see what's been written for us. If we go into our Bower components directory and Polymer Ajax, what you'll see is that there's a sample index file here which shows you how to use this element. Now, let's go to an example. I think it's the smoke test that we want to take a look at. What you'll see is that this is now gone and it's queried some API and it's returning some results. Let's actually try inspecting this. I'm going to move into doc to write mode in the DevTools just because I find that easier to work with. So here, what you'll notice is that everything in this page is actually being powered by this single Polymer element, Polymer Ajax. And the way that you configure this is using attributes. So I'm just saying, okay, well, auto basically says whenever the page loads up, I want you to automatically go and pull me this URL, query this URL with the parameters that I'm passing by. Notice that I'm not interacting with JavaScript at all here directly. I'm just passing through attributes that I'd like to configure this element with, and it's handling all of those XHR queries behind the scenes. Now, the next thing in this page worth noting is this template that we have here. And what this is basically doing is it's taking the response that's coming back from our Polymer Ajax element, and we're just repeating over response.feed.entry. And this is basically listing us out all of the different entries that came back from this YouTube search query. And basically the amount of code that I've had to write to get this working is extremely minimal. I've just had to say, okay, well, I want to use this element in my page. So I'm importing it in using HTML imports. So that's the line that's importing in a Polymer Ajax element. And when you scroll down, I'm just including the element in the page and including a template that's consuming the data. In this case, in our app where we're sort of working here, we did still have to work with a little bit of JavaScript to get the Polymer Ajax element actually doing what we wanted. We still had to touch the response and do some stuff ourselves. There's a lot less boilerplate here than you'll find in most frameworks that we've got available today, so that's kind of neat. Now another cool thing is that if I wanted to reduce even further the amount of boilerplate that we had on screen, and I'm let's say querying the YouTube API, I can actually say, okay, well, Bower install Polymer YT search. So this is a YouTube search component. So this is an element that does YouTube search. So it's just going to go and it's going to save. I'm just going to let it install. So it's gone and it's installed. Let's fire up our server once again. Go into our Bower components directory, YT search, and once again you'll see that it's actually gone and it's queried YouTube for some results. Now in this case, when we inspect our page, what you'll see here is that instead of Polymer Ajax, I just have YT search, and I haven't even had to configure the URL or the parameters. All of that has been abstracted away for me, because let's say I'm building an app that happens to be very sort of YouTube centric. It's a nice little client-side app for using YouTube, like the one we're building right now. I don't really care about configuring anything more than the parameters we saw earlier. And so all I care about here is just specifying a query, so in this case Chrome commercial. And what I'm doing at the end here is I'm saying, okay, well, I would like to bind the results that are coming back to a particular list. And so I'm using data binding here. And so I'm binding what comes back from Polymer Ajax to the template tag here. And I'm just saying, well, repeat over this list. And again, this means even less boilerplate that I have to work with. So we've seen what we can do with Bower, so that's really cool. Now another interesting thing is, let's say that we want to work on a completely brand new app. Let's go into a new directory. I'm just going to say, well, call it that, clear the screen. And this is where Yeoman is really useful. Now I'm going to introduce you to YoPolymer, and this is basically a generator for Yeoman. You can think of it as a scaffold, and this basically allows you to go and scaffold out new Polymer applications without having to worry about, you know, what boilerplate you need to use, what grunt tasks are good for an app using web components. It'll set up a lot of stuff for you, and it'll also pull in the dependencies you might want to use straight from Bower. So in this case, to install Yeoman, we just run npm install g, as it's a global utility, and then yo, and that's it. That'll install Yeoman, it'll install Bower, and it'll install grunt for you. So that's nice. And then to install generator Polymer, which is the Yeoman generator we're going to use for this, I just do npm install. Again, I can do g if I want. Generator Polymer, let that install. And because I already have it in my system, I can just go and run YoPolymer right now. So let's run YoPolymer. And it's going to just ask me a question or two before we get started, just to say, you know, well, do I have anything else that I can use to customize your workflow further? Now, let's say that I then want to go and scaffold out a new Polymer element. Well, I can do that using YoPolymer element. So this is a Yeoman subgenerator. And I can say, well, maybe I want to create a new sidebar. So I can just say YoPolymer element sidebar. And this will actually ask me some other questions too that can help me avoid having to write boilerplate myself. So would you like to include a constructor that sort of builds on top of another element? Would you like to import this element into your index.html file so you don't even have to wire it up yourself? And then it'll ask you if you'd like to import local elements into this one. So let's say we want to, build an app composed of other elements. We can do that very easily. I can just type in the names of elements in here. So if I had locally created some elements myself, I can just import them. But if not, and I just say no to this, it'll also ask me if I'd like to import any installed Bower elements into this page. So in this case, I can just say, okay, well, earlier, I installed Polymer Ajax. So I can just say, okay, well, go and add Polymer Ajax to this new file that you're creating. And the great thing here is that it'll wire it up, but it'll also include a little sample of that file inside my element for me. So let's actually take a look at what this looks like. I can go to a directory I created a little bit earlier. What Yeoman has done here is it's scaffolded out a new Polymer element containing all of the boilerplate you need to get started. It's HTML imported in Polymer Ajax, the element that we were using earlier. It's defined a new Polymer element with its own name and a attributes if you want to go and specify your own attributes. It's added some custom styling you can use to scope the styles for this element or style the host of the element if you want. It also has added in sort of the Polymer Ajax tag into your template so you don't have to go and do that yourself. Now inside Polymer Sidebar element, the part that we're hovering over right now, this is basically your registration for the element. And it currently includes some lifecycle callbacks. So ready is called whenever an element is fully prepared. Created is called whenever an instance of an element is created. Entered view whenever an instance, so your element, is actually inserted into the document. And there's a few others. Another one of interest is attribute changed. And this is basically something that's called whenever an attribute is added, removed, or updated. Now let's say that we have an attribute called error or something like that. We can actually say error changed is what happens whenever that attribute gets changed, and that will then fire a callback that we can use for reacting to that event inside of our element. So this is really powerful stuff. So let's take a look at the source for the Jukebox app that we've been building out. So I'm just going to go into Sublime and open that up. So here we've got an app scaffolded out using Yeoman. It's got grunt and grunt tasks set up. It's got our Bower dependencies installed too. And inside elements, you'll see that I've been scaffolding out two elements: YT input, which is sort of a custom input tag for my own needs, which fires off some additional events, and jukebox, so YT jukebox, so a YouTube jukebox. So let's talk about elements for a moment. Everything is an element in the Polymer world. So here you'll see that we have a jukebox element, a YouTube jukebox element, and that's the only tag that our index.html file contains. We're importing it using HTML imports, and the sources for this file are actually in YT jukebox.html over here. So at the top of this file we have some HTML imports that are importing in elements that we've written before that can be included and used in this page. We then have a Polymer element with a name, so YT Jukebox, as well as some attributes that we'd like to let users configure this element with. Next we have templates. So let's talk about template for a moment. So templates let you declare fragments of markup which are parsed as HTML and go unused at page load time but can be instantiated later on at runtime. Now this template element we see here represents a template in your markup. It contains template contents, which are sort of inert chunks of clonable DOM. You can sort of think of them as pieces of scaffolding that you can use and reuse throughout the lifetime of your app. Their content is effectively inert until they've been activated. Essentially your markup is sort of hidden DOM and it doesn't render. Now what we're doing with this Polymer element tag over here is basically going and we're creating our own custom element. Combined with sort of some JavaScript at the very bottom here that's basically registering the element. So this YT-jukebox thing, so Polymer YT Jukebox. Now one could say that the web lacks expression. If you remember looking at Gmail and DevTools at any time, you might think of it as looking a little bit like Div Soup. And that's how we build apps today. It's a little bit sad, and we should expect a little bit more from the platform. So HTML gives us a great tool for structuring a document, but its vocabulary is a little bit limited, and wouldn't it be great if we could sort of customize that with our own vocabulary? Custom elements let us define new types of HTML elements. They let us sort of unlock the ability to define new DOM elements and create elements that we can easily use to bundle together custom functionality into a single tag. So let's talk about these HTML imports at the very top. Think about how we currently load different resources on the web. For JavaScript, we have script tags. For CSS, we have link rel equals style sheet. Images have the image tag. Now, the majority of web content has a very simple and declarative way of loading itself, but HTML doesn't. Your current options for doing that are using iframes, which are very much true and tried, but they're a little bit heavyweight. Your content lives in a separate context to your page, and it can be a little bit frustrating. HTML imports are part of the Web Components cast, and they're a nice way of sort of including HTML documents in other documents. They're not limited to markup, like an import can include CSS, JavaScript, or anything else that a HTML file can contain. In other words, it makes imports this really fantastic tool for loading related HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. Now you might be wondering, well, what are these weird selectors here, and what is Shadow DOM? What do I actually get from being able to encapsulate and protect different parts of my page? Now, there's currently a fundamental problem that makes widgets that are built on HTML and JavaScript a little bit hard to use. The DOM tree inside a widget isn't encapsulated from the rest of the page. And this sort of lack of encapsulation means that your document style sheet might accidentally apply to parts that are inside the widget. Your JavaScript might accidentally modify parts that are inside the widget too. IDs might overlap with IDs inside a widget, and so on. Now, Shadow DOM fixes the DOM tree encapsulation problem, giving you more control over what's separated. So if we want to take a look at an example of Shadow DOM, we can actually dive straight back into the browser. So here I've got some HTML5 video on screen. I can go and I can inspect it. Now what you might be expecting to see is just a video tag, and that's what we've got here. We've got the video tag and we've got some sources inside of that tag. Now what if I were to tell you that browser vendors for a while have actually been building their own components, so things like the video tag, just using HTML and using Shadow DOM. So here I can actually go into the DevTools and settings, turn on Show Shadow DOM, and if we dive into the video tag once again, what you'll see is we have a document fragment in here now with some sort of grayed out lighter tags, and we're actually able to go and see all the individual pieces, all the individual elements, the ranges, the buttons that make up the video tag inside Chrome. We can go and we can change them if we want. So this stuff is actually really, really powerful. So it allows you to have access to the same tools that browser vendors have had for a while. And that's really, really powerful. So we're back to the source for our jukebox element, and I'm going to walk you through some of what's inside here. So here we have an input element, which I'm basically saying is YT input. So I'm extending this input element in a way that says, okay, well I want you to have some additional functionality that I'm defining inside my YT input tag. Now if we go and take a look at this tag, what you'll see is that similar to jukebox, it has a name, but it's extending the existing input tag that the browser has, but it's adding some additional sort of events to it. So it's saying that it now has a key up action and a key press action that I can bind to some custom functionality that allows me to then go and fire events off. So Polymer supports this idea of firing events when interesting things happen inside an application. So here I'm just using this.fire. And it gives me this really nice way of letting elements sort of react to each other whenever anything interesting happens in a very nice decoupled manner. So let's go back to our jukebox element. So here I have an input tag. The next thing that's of interest is we're using some sort of data binding here. So these probably look a little bit like handlebars, but we're basically binding some of the stuff that you see in the user interface to an object that we have lower down. So here we have sort of our element registration routine, and inside here we have a YouTube object that contains some interesting data, and we're able to bind the player state. So is the player stopped? Is it playing? Directly to our markup, so that whenever sort of our JavaScript objects change, our UI is instantly refreshed to display the current application state. We're doing the same thing with the object representing our initial playlist and our list. So you'll remember the Polymer Ajax we were looking at earlier. We're binding to a similar list. And some of the rest of the code is actually quite simple. So here's a version of the application with a little bit more code. And if we go through it, you'll notice that we've added some new things here. I have a new event that is called whenever our user actually goes and commits some text they've entered. So let's say that I've typed in a query, I've hit enter. This will now go and fire off some callback that you want. And in this case, I'm binding it to something called commit action. So if I go and actually look for commit action, what you'll see is that we're actually accessing something via the $sign. Now you're probably used to working with the $sign in jQuery. But this actually gives us a nice way of accessing the different elements within our scope without having to go and necessarily use query selector all. So here I'm going and I'm saying, okay, well, I would like the search query to be the value of this input element. Simple enough. What you'll notice in the top here is that we have an element called YT video. And this is basically a Polymer element that allows us to get access to a nice YouTube video embed. In addition, that has like sort of this nice rich API around it. So if we go to sort of YT video, you'll see that it actually has a nice rich API wrapping around YouTube's own API and allowing us to do a number of things very easily without having to set this up ourselves. So you'll see that YT video accepts a video ID, video entry, lets you say whether you want it to be muted or not, and a few other bits and pieces. But the way that we're using this is if we scroll down, you'll see that we have a section called player, and inside here we're just binding our video entry to a property called video. And so whenever a user goes and clicks on a video that they would like played, we just bind those two together, and so we just refresh the UI and instantly you're able to have that video playing with minimal boilerplate. So a lot of what's actually on this page is in fact what I'm using for styling, and I could probably even cut back on that if I wanted. The search in this page is basically just using our YouTube search, which I showed you inside of DevTools earlier. The only other things that I'm adding on top of this are an attribute letting me set the maximum number of results to query. I'm using the template tag here, once again, to iterate over a list that we're binding. Scroll down again, and there's nothing too fancy here. I'm once again using the template tag to sort of bind to my object called upcoming, where we're adding any new videos that you sort of click on to add into that object. We are doing something exactly the same using history. Scroll down a little bit more. This is the rest of our sort of registration for our element. We've got our ready lifecycle callback. We're just launching the player again, just setting some properties, nothing too crazy. And whenever you go and you push new objects into your arrays or your objects, it'll actually go and refresh the UI. So you have this nice constant view of the world, which is quite nice and quite desirable. Now, let's say that we actually wanted to get tabs to display around these components here. So what you'll notice in the UI that I was showing you earlier is at the very bottom we actually have tabs. So we have an upcoming tab and a history tab, and I'm able to switch back and forth between them. Now to get tabs into my application, I can actually go back to Bower and I can say, well, Bower install Polymer Ui Tabs, and save once again. And this basically gives me a really nice component that already has the ability to create tabs, and we can go and we can view source on this. I can go into my app, Polymer Ui Tabs, and if we take a look at the index for an example, you'll see that we have minimum boilerplate here for tabs. This is all the code that's necessary to use this element. So I'm just saying, okay, well, I want to use this tag. I want to set the index of what should be selected here, and then my spans are basically just saying, okay, well, what tabs would you like to define? No JavaScript on my part has to be written. It's just really, really nice and declarative. And then if you want to go actually look at the source for this, you can configure this element a little bit more yourself, but it's all very pleasant to use. So if we actually take a look at a version of the application that happens to be using Polymer Ui Tabs, so here we're importing it into the application, we can scroll down and see, okay, well, here I basically have Polymer Ui Tabs. It's got upcoming, it's got history, and I'm just handling what happens when the user actually clicks on those things using a sort of a function called switch to tab, which will just change the index of what's visible. So that's it's relatively little code for something that's actually quite powerful and very functional, which is cool. Now, another difference between my app and the Angular app is that I actually include ratings in this nice little sort of set of stars inside each of my search results. Now, the way to get that is once again using Bower. So let's sort of clear the screen. Now, if I do Bower install Polymer Ui ratings and save that, what that'll give me is a new ratings component. So I can save that. Wait for it to go and install. It's done. And if you go into app, you go to Bower components once again, you'll see that we have ratings here. And all I have to do to start using ratings is this one tag. I include this element using an import, and then I just say what the value I want out of sort of the limit on the count of those stars is. So here you can see we're configuring it a little bit further. We're saying, okay, well, I'd like to set this by default to be 5 out of 10 stars. By default, the count is going to be 5. But you can easily configure this to be whatever you want. Here you'll see that we're probably just using 5 stars, but inside my jukebox code, it actually doesn't require me to do much more. All I'm doing here is I've got Polymer UI ratings, and I'm just pulling in some metadata from that Polymer Ajax request that just says, okay, well, rating that average is what I want to use, and that's it. I'm just going to sort of round that up and display it inside my UI. So yeah, this is what you start off with, and hopefully this is what you end up with, and it's really awesome. You can just go and you can type in whatever artist you want. You can select them, add them to your playlist. You can have it sort of constantly play things, and it's nice. So I hope you found this video useful. Do check out Polymer at polymer-project.org. You can find out more about Yeoman at yeoman.io, and yeah, please feel free to hit me up if you have any questions about any of this stuff at all. So thank you.